Hello, and welcome to the World War Lab channel. Today's story takes us high above occupied Europe, inside a bomber that should not have been able to fly at all. At 9:42 a.m. on July 14, 1944, First Lieutenant Evald Swanson sat in the cockpit of a B-17G Flying Fortress nicknamed Mizpah, watching black bursts of flak blossom across the sky over Budapest. He was 24 years old, had already completed 17 combat missions, and there was absolutely no margin left for error. Below them, the Luftwaffe had ringed the railway yards with more than 288 heavy anti-aircraft guns, and every one of them was firing. Swanson's B-17 was part of a 60-aircraft formation from the 483rd Bomb Group, flying out of Sturparone, Italy. On paper, the mission sounded straightforward. Strike the Shell oil refinery and the railway yards in the heart of German-controlled Budapest. Sever the supply lines feeding the Eastern Front. Then turn south and make it home. But by July of 1944, crews in the 15th Air Force understood the numbers all too well. Out of every 10 men who climbed into a B-17, only 2 were likely to return. Some would be killed. Some would be captured. Others would vanish without a trace. The formation pushed on through the wall of flak. Shells detonated in dense black clouds, fragments capable of ripping aluminum skin like paper. Mizpah was hit in the tail first, then the wings. Shards of steel punched clean holes through the fuselage, but the bomber held its position in the formation. Behind Swanson, every crewman stayed at his station. Second Lieutenant Paul Burnett sat in the co-pilot seat. In the nose, Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley manned the bombardier position, while Second Lieutenant Joseph Henderson navigated beside him. 8 more men were spread throughout the aircraft: radio operator, gunners, and the flight engineer, each one waiting for the next explosion. They were only seconds from the target when Dudley released the bombs. 2 tons of high explosives dropped away toward the railway yards far below. As the weight fell free, the B-17 lurched upward. Then an 88mm shell slammed directly into the nose of the aircraft. The detonation was instantaneous. The entire forward section of Mizpah simply vanished. The nose compartment, the bombardier station, the navigator's position, the Norden bomb site, the plexiglass panels. Everything forward of the cockpit ceased to exist in a single violent flash. Dudley was killed instantly. Henderson was killed instantly. The blast tore through what remained of the airframe, erasing the metal structure that had housed 2 men and thousands of pounds of equipment. With the nose gone, the aircraft's center of gravity shifted violently backward. Deprived of its forward weight, Mizpah pitched up into a near-vertical climb. The bomber began to stall. Swanson could see open sky where his instruments should have been. At 30,000 feet, frigid air screamed through the gaping hole. The temperature was 40 degrees below zero. The wind ripped at his flight suit. Blood from the explosion coated the flight deck. Through the empty space where the nose had once been, Swanson could see the rest of the formation continuing toward the rally point, unaware of what had just happened behind them. There was no control column. The yoke that connected to the flight controls had been mounted to the forward structure, and that structure no longer existed. There were no instruments either. The entire panel had been attached to the nose section, which was now gone. Swanson had no airspeed indicator, no altimeter, no artificial horizon. He had no way of knowing what the aircraft was doing except by instinct and by watching the horizon through the massive opening in front of him. But the control cables were still there. Steel cables ran from what remained of the cockpit through the fuselage to the rudder, elevators, and ailerons. They were exposed now, whipping violently in the wind, but they were unbroken. Somehow, Swanson forced the bomber's nose down. He didn't know how. There was nothing left to push or pull. Yet, against all logic, he managed to level the aircraft. Somehow, he brought it back into a loose formation with the rest of the group. The B-17 should have been unflyable. Boeing engineers had designed the aircraft with exceptional stability, but no one had ever planned for a bomber flying without a nose or cockpit. No manual described this situation. The only things keeping Mizpah airborne were physics and desperation. If you want to see how Swanson's crew literally grabbed those bare control cables to keep the aircraft flying, hit the like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Now, back to Swanson. Behind him, the surviving crew began moving forward. The radio operator, the flight engineer. They could see the exposed cables running through the bomb bay. They could feel the wind tearing through the aircraft. They immediately understood what would have to happen next. More than 200 anti-aircraft guns were still firing below. The formation was still deep over enemy territory. And another shell was already on its way toward engine number 2. At 9:44 a.m., a second 88mm shell struck engine number 2. The right cyclone radial engine erupted in a spray of oil and twisted metal. Flames streamed back along the inboard nacelle on the wing. The propeller windmilled for 3 seconds, then froze solid. Engine number 2 was dead. Mizpah now had 3 engines instead of 4. The bomber immediately began to lose airspeed. The rest of the formation slowly pulled ahead. Without cockpit instruments, Swanson had no way to measure just how fast they were falling behind. Technical Sergeant Frank Menzie, the flight engineer, made his way forward from the top turret. The problem was obvious the moment he saw it. The control cables ran through the fuselage in bundled lines: elevator cables, rudder cables, aileron cables. Each was steel wire rope, about 3/8 of an inch thick. Under normal conditions, they were routed through pulleys and fairleads, hidden behind panels and structure. Now they were completely exposed, snapping and straining in the wind. Without someone physically holding those cables steady, the aircraft would become uncontrollable. Staff Sergeant George Simelli moved up from the radio compartment. Staff Sergeant Robert Bell came forward from the waist gun position. They took their places near the bomb bay, where the main cable runs were visible. There was no argument, no discussion. The reality was clear to all of them. Someone had to hold the cables. Someone had to pull them whenever Swanson needed to move the control surfaces. The problem was coordination. Swanson was still sitting in what remained of the cockpit, more than 40 feet forward. The crew was clustered around the bomb bay. The intercom system had been damaged in the blast. Communication would be nearly impossible. Swanson tried pressing the rudder pedals. Nothing happened. The pedals were still bolted to the floor, but the cables they controlled were being violently buffeted by nearly 300 miles per hour wind. He tried the throttles. Engines 1, 3, and 4 responded. At least that still worked. But without control of the flight surfaces, the B-17 would eventually fall out of formation and enter an uncontrollable dive. Or worse, it would pitch up again, stall, and spin. Either outcome meant death for everyone on board. The crew began to pull. They wrapped sections of the steel cables around their hands to get a grip. The metal was ice cold. It cut into their gloves. When they pulled left on the rudder cable, Mizpah's nose swung left. When they pulled right, it swung right. The elevators reacted the same way. Pull back and the nose rose. Ease off and it dropped. The danger was that every single movement had to be perfectly timed. Too much force and the aircraft would overcorrect. Too little and nothing would happen at all. And they were doing this blind, without seeing what Swanson was seeing, without knowing what corrections he needed, without instruments, gauges, or indicators of any kind. Mizpah continued to fall behind the formation. The other B-17s maintained cruising speed, turning southwest toward the Adriatic. Swanson's bomber was slower now. The drag created by the missing nose section was enormous. The loss of one engine meant less power, and the formation could not slow down. It never did. Every extra minute over Hungary meant more exposure to fighters and flak. Standard procedure was unforgiving. Aircraft that could not maintain formation speed were abandoned. By 9:46 a.m., Mizpah was alone. The formation was a mile ahead, then 2. Swanson could still see them, dark shapes clustered against the pale summer sky, but they were steadily pulling away. His own aircraft was losing altitude. Not suddenly, but relentlessly. Over the target they had been at 30,000 feet. Now they were at 29,000. Then 28,000. The crew kept hauling on the cables. Their hands were cramping. The cold was savage. Blood flow was being cut off where steel wire pressed into their palms, but none of them let go. The fuel situation was completely unknown. The gauges had vanished with the instrument panel. Swanson had no idea how much gasoline remained in the wing tanks. He had no idea how long 3 engines could keep them airborne. He didn't even know for certain if they were heading in the correct direction. Navigation required instruments. It required charts. It required a navigator who was now dead somewhere over Budapest. All Swanson knew was one word: southwest. Fly southwest. Get out of Hungary. Cross Yugoslavia. Reach the Adriatic. Make it back to Italy. Get home. Then the men in the bomb bay began waving frantically toward the rear of the aircraft. Swanson couldn't turn around to look. The pressure of the wind blasting through the open nose cavity made any movement dangerous. If he unbuckled from the pilot's seat, the airflow could rip him forward and out of the aircraft. He stayed locked in place, eyes on the horizon, fighting to keep the wings level. But the crew kept waving. Something was wrong in the rear of the bomber. Something worse than the missing nose, worse than the dead engine, worse than the exposed control cables. Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker, the tail gunner, had been in his position when the nose exploded. The tail was the most isolated station on a B-17, a cramped compartment at the very end of the fuselage, reachable only by crawling through the waist gun area on hands and knees. Tucker had felt the initial impact. He had felt the aircraft pitch violently upward. He had felt it stabilize. Now he was feeling something else. The tail structure was flexing. The metal framework supporting the vertical and horizontal stabilizers was moving in ways it was never meant to move. The explosion had either created stress fractures in the fuselage or weakened critical support members with shrapnel. Whatever the cause, the tail section was beginning to fail. If the tail came off, everyone would die instantly. A-17 without a tail would enter an unrecoverable spin, tumbling end over end until it disintegrated in midair or slammed into the ground. There would be no warning, no time to bail out, no chance to react. The men in the bomb bay understood this immediately. They could see the tail gunner's position down the length of the fuselage. They could see the structure shifting and twisting. And there was nothing they could do to fix it. Mizpah passed through 26,000 feet, still descending, still tracking southwest. Swanson guessed they had been flying without a cockpit for 4 minutes, maybe 5. Every second felt stretched into an hour. The roar of the wind was overwhelming. The cold seeped through every layer of his flight suit. His hands, wrapped around the throttles, were going numb, but the throttles were the only controls he had left. Engine power was the one thing he could still adjust without relying on the men pulling cables in the bomb bay. Second Lieutenant Paul Burnett, the co-pilot, was still in his seat. His control column was gone. His instruments were gone. But he watched the wings. He watched the engines. He scanned the sky for fighters. German Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s hunted lone bombers. A damaged B-17 separated from its formation was a perfect target. No overlapping defensive fire. No mutual support. Just one crippled aircraft bleeding altitude over enemy territory. But for now, no fighters appeared. Either the Luftwaffe was engaged elsewhere, or they simply hadn't spotted Mizpah yet. The crew kept pulling the cables. Their coordination slowly improved. When Swanson throttled back engine number 1, the aircraft tried to yaw right. The crew compensated by hauling on the left rudder cable. When he increased power on engine number 4, they adjusted again. This wasn't flying. It was survival through brute force. 10 men working as a single organism to keep 65,000 pounds of aluminum and steel in the air. At 9:50 a.m., Mizpah crossed the Hungarian border into Yugoslavia. Swanson didn't know it. He had no map. No identifiable landmarks visible through the gaping hole where the cockpit used to be. But the flak stopped. The black clouds of explosions vanished. That meant they were clear of the heaviest defensive zones. That meant there was a chance. A small chance. A chance that depended entirely on how long the tail structure would hold together. How long the crew could keep pulling cables. How long 3 engines could continue producing thrust. The fuel gauges were gone, but Swanson could hear the engines. He could feel their vibration through the airframe. They were running smoothly. That meant fuel was still flowing. That meant the wing tanks weren't empty yet. But how much remained was impossible to know. A B-17 carried roughly 2,800 gallons of aviation gasoline spread across multiple tanks. At cruise power, 4 engines burned around 200 gallons per hour. But they weren't at cruise. They were running at maximum continuous power on 3 engines, fighting to hold altitude and airspeed. Fuel consumption was far higher, dangerously higher. Swanson made a decision. It was a simple one. Get the crew out. The aircraft was dying. The tail was failing. The fuel supply was unknown. They were still over occupied territory. Every additional minute in the air increased the risk of catastrophic structural failure. If Mizpah broke apart at altitude, no one would survive. But if the crew could bail out while the aircraft was still controllable, most of them would have a chance. They would be captured. They would spend months, maybe years, in prisoner-of-war camps. But they would be alive. The problem was execution. Bailing out of a B-17 required precise coordination. The standard procedure involved specific exit points. Normally, the bombardier and navigator used the forward escape hatch in the nose, but that hatch no longer existed. The radio operator and several others exited through the waist gun windows or the rear door. The ball turret gunner had to rotate his turret into a precise position before he could climb out. Every crewman had practiced this procedure dozens of times during training. But training assumed the aircraft was intact. Training assumed the pilot could speak over the intercom. Training assumed there was time to organize a controlled evacuation. Swanson had none of that. He had no intercom. No way to issue the order. No way to decide who went first or who stayed last. And he could not leave his position. The moment he unbuckled, the moment he tried to move toward an exit, the aircraft would become uncontrollable. The men in the bomb bay would lose any reference for which cables to pull. The B-17 would enter a dive or a spin within seconds. Everyone still aboard would be killed. At 9:52 a.m., Mizpah was down to 24,000 feet. They had been flying without a cockpit for 10 minutes. Swanson's hands were clamped around the throttles. His feet rested on the rudder pedals, even though the pedals themselves did nothing unless the crew 30 feet behind him physically pulled the cables. Burnett sat perfectly still in the co-pilot's seat, eyes fixed on the horizon, scanning the wings, watching for any sign that the aircraft was about to come apart. Neither man spoke. There was nothing to say. Even if there had been, the roar of the wind made speech impossible. The men in the bomb bay made the decision themselves. They could feel the tail section flexing. They could see stress fractures spreading across the fuselage skin. They understood that staying aboard meant dying when the aircraft finally failed. One by one, they began moving toward the waist gun windows. Staff Sergeant Robert Bell went first. He clipped his parachute harness, positioned himself at the open window, and jumped. The slipstream seized him instantly and pulled him clear of the aircraft. Staff Sergeant Charles Kelly followed. Then Staff Sergeant George Simelli. Then Technical Sergeant Frank Comenci. Each time a man jumped, the aircraft became harder to control. With fewer hands on the cables, control inputs grew less precise. The bomber began to wallow. The wings dipped left, then right. The nose pitched up slightly. Swanson adjusted the throttle settings to counter the motion, but engine power alone wasn't enough. He needed the rudder. He needed the elevators. He needed the crew pulling the cables, but the crew was leaving. They had to. It was the only rational choice. Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker, the tail gunner, crawled forward from his isolated position at the rear of the aircraft. He squeezed through the narrow passage, emerged into the waist gun area, and saw empty spaces where his crewmates had been standing only moments earlier. He saw the exposed control cables hanging slack, no hands gripping them. He saw the massive opening 40 feet forward where the nose of the aircraft used to be. He clipped on his parachute and jumped. By 9:54 a.m., 5 men had evacuated the aircraft. 5 parachutes drifted down over Yugoslavia. 5 men would be captured by German forces within hours, but 5 men would live. That left 5 still aboard Mizpah. Swanson in the pilot's seat, Burnett in the co-pilot seat, and 3 others who had not yet reached an exit. The aircraft was at 22,000 feet, still descending, barely controllable, and the tail structure was on the verge of complete failure. The remaining crew members moved toward the exits. Staff Sergeant Paul Hish, a waist gunner, went through the window opening. His parachute deployed cleanly. Staff Sergeant Robert Tucker, another waist gunner, followed seconds later. Now only 3 men remained aboard: Swanson, Burnett, and one last crewman still making his way forward from a rear position. The aircraft's instability worsened. With almost no one left pulling the control cables, Mizpah responded only to engine power and whatever inherent aerodynamic stability remained. That stability had been designed for normal flight conditions, not for an aircraft missing its entire nose section, not for one with a failing tail. At 9:56 a.m., the final crew member reached the waist gun area, jumped, and vanished into the slipstream. Swanson and Burnett were alone. 2 men inside the shattered remains of a B-17 Flying Fortress at 20,000 feet over Yugoslavia. The bomber continued to descend. 3 engines were still running, but the aircraft was no longer truly flyable. It stayed aloft only through a fragile balance of residual stability and the simple fact that the wings were still producing lift. Without crewmen pulling the cables, meaningful control was impossible. Swanson turned his head slightly and met Burnett's eyes. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Burnett had to go. There was no reason for the co-pilot to remain aboard. He had no controls, no function. If he stayed, he would die when the aircraft finally broke apart or slammed into the ground. The only logical choice was to bail out while there was still altitude, while there was still time for a parachute to open. Burnett unbuckled his harness. He stood from the co-pilot's seat and carefully moved toward the rear of the flight deck, where he could access the main fuselage. He reached the waist gun exit and looked back one last time. Swanson was still locked in place, hands on the throttles, eyes forward, holding the dying aircraft as steady as he possibly could. Burnett crawled through the passage behind the cockpit and headed aft. 30 seconds later, he jumped. Evald Swanson was alone. One man in a 65,000-pound bomber at 19,000 feet. The aircraft was descending at roughly 200 feet per minute. Not a dive, just a steady, relentless loss of altitude. The 3 remaining engines produced enough thrust to maintain forward speed, but not enough to hold altitude. The missing nose created enormous drag. The aircraft's aerodynamic shape was destroyed. The B-17 was essentially a flying brick with wings. The fuel situation was still unknown. The wing tanks could have been nearly full or nearly empty. There was no way to tell. The engines gave no warning. Wright Cyclone engines ran smoothly right up until the instant fuel was exhausted. No sputtering. No gradual fade. Just sudden silence. And if all 3 engines quit at once, Mizpah would fall straight out of the sky. Swanson tried to estimate their position. They had been flying southwest for approximately 14 minutes since leaving Budapest. Airspeed was probably around 180 miles per hour, maybe less. That meant they had covered roughly 40 miles, perhaps 45. The Hungarian-Yugoslav border lay about 30 miles from Budapest, which meant they were likely over Yugoslavia now, possibly nearing the mountains, possibly drifting toward the Adriatic coast. But all of it was guesswork. Without instruments, without maps, Without a navigator, Swanson was flying blind. The real question was how long to stay with the aircraft. Every extra minute at the controls meant the men who had already bailed out would have more distance between themselves and the eventual crash site. German patrols would search the area for a downed bomber. But if Swanson could keep Mizpah airborne just a little longer, those parachuting crewmen would land miles away from where the aircraft finally hit the ground. That separation could mean everything. The difference between immediate capture and slipping away, between imprisonment and a chance at freedom. But staying aboard also meant increasing his own chances of dying. The tail structure was still flexing. The bomber could tear itself apart at any moment. And when Swanson finally chose to bail out, he would have to unbuckle, stand up, move through the aircraft to an exit, and jump, while the B-17 was uncontrolled, possibly already entering a fatal spiral. At 9:58 a.m., Swanson made his final decision. He would stay with the aircraft for 2 more minutes. That would give the crew more separation. That would give them a better chance. After that, he would go. Swanson kept both hands on the throttles. The 3 remaining right Cyclone engines maintained their steady roar, engine number 1 on the far left wing, engine number 3 inboard on the right, and engine number 4 on the far right. All were running smoothly, all consuming fuel at an unknown rate. The bomber passed through 18,000 feet. At exactly 10 a.m., Swanson released the throttles and unbuckled his harness. The instant the straps came loose, the wind pressure tried to yank him forward toward the massive opening where the nose of the aircraft used to be. He pushed back against the seat, then carefully stood. The moment he left the controls, the aircraft began to change attitude. With no one managing the throttles and no corrective inputs, Mizpah started a slow roll to the left. Swanson moved quickly toward the rear of the flight deck. He squeezed through the narrow crawlway leading into the bomb bay. Behind him, the bomber's nose dropped. The exposed control cables in the bomb bay hung slack. No one was pulling them now. No one was holding the aircraft steady. He could feel the B-17 accelerating into a dive. He had maybe 30 seconds, before the angle became too steep, before the G-forces made movement impossible, before the aircraft entered a spin. Swanson reached the waist gun area. The aluminum floor vibrated under his boots. The wind was deafening. He grabbed his parachute pack from its storage rack, clipped it to his harness, and moved toward the open window. The bomber was diving now, not straight down, but steep enough that he had to brace himself against the fuselage just to stay upright. He positioned himself at the waist gun opening, looked down at the Yugoslav countryside 17,000 feet below, and jumped. The slipstream struck him like a solid wall. The wind spun him violently sideways. The B-17 flashed past, engine still roaring, already 200 feet away and accelerating downward. Swanson pulled the ripcord. The parachute opened with a brutal jolt that drove the air from his lungs. Then came silence, relative silence. The thunder of the engines faded as Mizpah continued its final dive. Swanson watched the bomber fall. The tail section was still attached, but barely. The entire rear fuselage flexed like a reed in a storm. At 15,000 feet, the tail finally tore away. The forward section of the B-17 pitched almost straight down. It fell for another 8 seconds, then vanished into a line of trees roughly 2 miles away. Moments later, a column of black smoke climbed into the sky as the fuel tanks ignited on impact. Nothing survived that crash. No one could have. If Swanson had stayed aboard for even 30 seconds longer, he would have died with it. The parachute descent was slow. Carried by the prevailing wind, Swanson drifted southwest. Below him stretched the Yugoslav countryside, scattered farms, forests, and small villages. Somewhere down there were German occupation troops. Somewhere down there were the crewmen who had jumped minutes before him. And somewhere down there was the undeniable truth that his war was over. He was about to become a prisoner. The ground rose faster than he expected. He saw trees rushing up to meet him. He tried to steer the parachute toward an open patch of land, but the canopy wasn't built for precise control. The trees were directly beneath him now. He struck the upper branches at roughly 15 miles per hour. Branches snapped. The parachute canopy snagged in the limbs. Swanson crashed through leaves and wood and slammed into a thick branch on his left side. He felt his left leg break. The bone snapped cleanly somewhere between knee and ankle. Pain detonated through his body. He dropped another 10 feet before coming to a halt, tangled in parachute lines and broken branches, hanging about 15 feet above the ground. Blood streamed down his leg. His flight suit was shredded. Deep gashes covered his left thigh where branches had torn through fabric and flesh. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. He couldn't move it. He couldn't put any weight on it. He couldn't climb down. He hung there, suspended in his harness, fighting the pain, forcing himself to stay conscious. Below him, he heard voices, German voices. German soldiers reached the base of the tree within minutes. They were Wehrmacht infantry, part of an occupation unit stationed nearby. They had seen the parachutes descending. They had heard the crash of the B-17. Now they were gathering the American aircrew. Swanson remained motionless in his harness, 15 feet above the ground, unable to move, unable to escape. One of the soldiers called up to him. Swanson didn't answer. The men spoke among themselves, discussing how to get him down. They found a ladder at a nearby farm. 2 soldiers climbed up and cut the parachute lines, lowering Swanson carefully so as not to worsen the injury. When they reached the ground, they laid him flat on his back in the dirt. A German medic arrived. He examined the shattered leg, the deep lacerations, the blood loss. He improvised a splint using wooden boards and strips of cloth. He administered morphine from his medical kit. The pain began to recede, dulling from sharp agony to a distant throb. The medic cleaned and bandaged the cuts, then checked for additional injuries. The ribs appeared intact. There was no obvious head trauma. No signs of internal bleeding that he could detect. The leg was the primary concern. Without proper treatment, infection would set. Without surgery, the bone might never set correctly. But in a forest clearing with limited supplies, the medic had done everything possible. Swanson was transported to a local German command post. From there, he was moved to a Wehrmacht medical facility. A German doctor examined his leg, confirmed the fracture, and reset the bone properly. Even with morphine, the procedure was agonizing. Swanson lost consciousness twice while the bone was being aligned. When he finally came to, his leg was encased in a heavy plaster cast running from ankle to hip. Through an interpreter, the doctor explained that the break was clean. The bone would heal, but Swanson would not walk normally for months. Over the next 3 days, the rest of Mizpah's crew was captured. All 8 men who had bailed out were found within a 20-mile radius of the crash site. None of them managed to evade capture. The Yugoslav countryside was heavily patrolled. Partisan groups operated in the mountains, but the crew had landed in open farmland firmly under German control. One by one, they were brought to the same processing center. Swanson watched them arrive. Burnett, Menzi, Simonelli, Bell, Kelly, Tucker, all alive. All mostly uninjured, aside from cuts and bruises. All now prisoners of war. They were transported north to a prisoner-of-war camp in Austria, Stalag Luft 4, a facility designated specifically for captured Allied aircrew. The camp held roughly 10,000 American and British pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and flight engineers. Conditions were harsh but not overtly brutal. Food was scarce. Red Cross parcels arrived irregularly. Barracks were bitterly cold in winter. Medical care was minimal. But for officer prisoners, the Germans generally adhered to the Geneva Convention. There were no mass executions. No systematic torture. Just confinement, monotony, and waiting. Swanson's leg healed slowly. For the first 2 months, he relied on crutches. The cast was removed in September of 1944. Physical therapy consisted of little more than walking. Every day, he circled the camp perimeter, rebuilding strength in the damaged leg. By October, he could walk unassisted. By November, the limp was barely noticeable. By December, he was physically recovered. The war, however, was not. The camp gates remained locked. Guards patrolled the wire. Escape attempts were rare and usually failed. The crew of Mizpah settled into captivity. They talked endlessly about the mission, about the 88mm shell, about the 10 minutes they flew without a cockpit, about gripping bare control cables with frozen hands, about watching their bomber plunge into a Yugoslav forest, about Dudley and Henderson, who died instantly when the nose exploded, about how close all of them had come to dying that day. And they waited. They waited for the war to end. They waited for liberation. They waited to go home. Winter gave way to spring. As Soviet forces advanced from the east, the Germans began evacuating POW camps. Prisoners were marched westward in long columns. Conditions worsened rapidly. Food all but disappeared. Some men died during the forced marches. Others escaped amid the chaos. Swanson and his crew stayed together. They marched across Germany as the Third Reich collapsed around them. And on April 30, 1945, American forces reached their column. They were free. 9 months of captivity ended on a dirt road in central Germany. American tanks rolled past. Soldiers handed out food, water, and cigarettes. Medics checked the former prisoners for disease and injury. From there, they were moved to collection points, then to airfields, back to Italy, and eventually home to the United States. The crew of Mizpah went home. All 8 survivors. All 8 men who had pulled control cables by hand at 30,000 feet over Budapest. All 8 men who had jumped from a dying bomber and lived. Evald Swanson returned to civilian life in Michigan. He married, raised a family, and worked quietly for decades. He rarely spoke about July 14, 1944. When asked, he would say only that he had been lucky, that the crew had been lucky, that Dudley and Henderson had not been lucky. He never considered himself a hero. He considered himself a pilot who had done his job under impossible circumstances. The Army Air Forces disagreed. Swanson was promoted in the years after the war, eventually retiring as a lieutenant colonel. The recognition was for an entire career of service, not a single mission, but that mission remained the defining moment. The 10 minutes without a cockpit. The 10 minutes that should have killed everyone aboard. The crew stayed in touch. They attended 483rd Bomb Group reunions. Every few years, they gathered to remember the war, the missions, and the men who never returned. The bond between them never faded. They had survived something that should not have been survivable. They had flown a bomber with no nose, no instruments, no cockpit, only bare control cables whipping in a 300-mile-per-hour wind. They had done it through coordination, through determination, through a simple refusal to give up. And they honored Dudley and Henderson by surviving, by making sure their sacrifice meant something. Paul Burnett, the co-pilot, remained in Michigan near Swanson. They stayed friends for the rest of their lives. Frank Remensi returned to his family and rarely spoke about the war. George Simonelli kept photographs from the mission. Decades later, he showed them to his grandchildren, explaining what it meant to pull steel cables while a bomber came apart around you. The others scattered across the country, but they remembered. They all remembered. Evald Swanson died in 2009 at the age of 89. He lived a full life. He watched the world change. He saw aviation evolve from propeller-driven bombers to jets to spacecraft. But the aircraft he remembered most clearly was Mizpah, the B-17G that lost its nose over Budapest. The bomber that flew on borrowed time and human determination. The aircraft that proved willpower could overcome engineering limits. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to share this story with more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about bomber crews who refused to quit when physics said they should. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. The United States? The United Kingdom? Canada? Australia? Our community spans the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us where you're from. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Evald Swanson and the crew of Mizpah do not disappear into silence. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley died instantly when that 88mm shell struck the nose. Second Lieutenant Joseph Henderson died beside him. They were 23 and 24 years old. They never came home. But the 8 men who survived carried their memory, through 9 months in a prisoner of war camp, through decades of life afterward in Michigan and across America. And now, through this story, their names live on. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that